How are you, Jessica, and thank you very much for joining us, looking at this, and what do you expect from this NPC? Will it be all about Washington, or will it be more inward-looking?
Thanks so much for having me. I think first and foremost, the Chinese Communist Party is focused on, getting its domestic house in order, keeping the public safe amidst, growing coronavirus infections, and getting the economy back on track. I think they aren't interested in a disruption with the United States, but are ready to fight back, depending on what new pressure comes from Washington.
Well, absolutely. Then there's certainly a diversionary tactic perhaps being employed there, as they can blame Washington for some of this discord, and that would actually perhaps paper over mistakes which may have been made when the coronavirus first took hold in Wuhan.
It's true that, as the Chinese propaganda apparatus, got into high gear, they, prominent spokespeople were indulging in conspiracy theories, trying to shift blame to the United States for the coronavirus. But we've seen, I think, in some growing signs of recognition that that aggressive diplomatic style is backfiring on China abroad. And so I actually think that we might see a tactical retooling where the Chinese government is less focused on blaming foreigners and more focused on doing things well at home.
And Jessica, Selena here in Beijing, how do you see domestic growing nationalism playing into these discussions with the U.S.? And it sounds like you are saying you see it paring back a bit.
Well, China's, I think, witnessed a very frightening time for the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping's leadership at the outset. But as the government wound the virus down and saw how badly other countries were struggling with this, it really emboldened Chinese nationalists and propagandists to claim, the superiority of Chinese efforts. And those, aggressive diplomatic efforts, that nationalist finger pointing, really was given a very large megaphone by, Chinese diplomatic personnel. But, as in previous cycles, you've seen the Chinese government give a much longer leash to nationalist voices when they have wanted to show resolve and make a point. But once that's been made and, the Chinese government wants to minimize the risk of domestic and international escalation, that's when they've, reined them in a bit. So I think we might see some move in that direction, given how badly things are going for China in terms of its kind of global image.
We know that the harsh rhetoric coming out of the U.S. is partially driven by the upcoming elections, but more broadly, is the U.S. misinterpreting or overstating China's broader ambitions as this existential threat that has aims far beyond just its own regional stability?
You're absolutely right that many in the United States are now debating whether the United States is entering a new Cold War. But I think that analogy, obscures more than it reveals. And the biggest problem with the Cold War analogy is the idea that, China's, socialism with Chinese characteristics represents an existential threat to liberal democracy. It's, not since the days of Mao Zedong has the Chinese Communist Party sought to topple democracy or export a revolution worldwide. In my view, what the Chinese Communist Party seeks is its own security, it seeks regional dominance, and it seeks an international order that it has room for and is hospitable to Chinese values and interests. And this is fundamentally a nationalist vision rather than an ideological crusade to remake other countries in China's image. And so when we've seen with China's mask diplomacy, for example, the political strings that has come with has been demands that others praise China's efforts and mute criticism of China's early missteps. But it's not been, demands that other countries copy, Chinese-style authoritarianism. So I think that some of these concerns are still at this, stage premature.
Jessica, has this accelerated the process of the bipolarization of the world? Perhaps this had all been started off with a trade war, and the pandemic has perhaps just moved things along quicker, as it were. One can't help but make comparisons with the Cold War, although it would be entirely different.
I think one of the biggest casualties of the pandemic, has been the kind of upset to the global economy, and in particular the concerns that the U.S. China trade deal might now be in jeopardy, because that was one of the main forces of restraint on both sides, and now as that it may still restrain this sort of headlong rush into a full-blown Cold War on many different fronts. And nonetheless, I think that's been, one of the biggest changes is that economic disruption.
And Jessica, how much of a threat is that economic disruption, rising unemployment, reduction in people's incomes to social stability?
In China, I think this is only accelerating the trend away from the Chinese Communist Party's emphasis on growth as the primary measure or justification for authoritarian rule. Instead, they have increasingly relied on nationalism and the claim of claiming to rule over a stable and secure China. And that is what they're going to continue to lean into, particularly as growth has turned negative for the first time in decades in this first quarter.